There we go. Sorry about that. Had a quick hiccup there. I was actually listening to some Rhapsody of Fire to actually just get a little bit fired up for a talk about the day one of spoilers, essentially. So, thought it would be kind of fun to do that. Nevertheless, welcome everybody for tonight's spoiler day one review. I thought it would be fun just to talk about it using the stream and such, and just essentially talk about my overall opinions of the cards. I'm not sure if it's going to be like a finalized review or anything. It's just mostly my first impressions and what I think about the card for both Standard and Commander, as well as potentially Oathbreaker as well. So that's going to be 2 cents off this. We're actually using Scryfall, great website, to actually catch up with the spoilers and such. So I thought it would just be fun to just do the shenanigans, talk about the cards, and start off with one that actually people are already seen during the holidays, but I thought it's good to start off with this. Toski, Bearer of Secrets. Free and a green for a legendary creature. Square! It's a 1-1. The spell can't be countered, indestructible. This creature attacks each combat if able, as well as whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. This is a pretty good card. Like, okay, first things first. I love this card for the factor that we finally got another kind of like standard legal squirrel that we can actually use as a commander for Squirrel Tribal. As you know, a majority of standard legal, well, not even standard, a majority of magic cards that are non-silver bordered in the Squirrel Tribe are green. Yes, technically it's green-black, but that's if you're including the uncards, which that's a different story entirely. But majority of legalized magic cards in internal formats are just mono green. So being able to get a Squirrel Commander for that is actually really nice. As for the standard implications of the card, it's actually pretty cool. Like, it's one of those cards where being uncountable is really legit good. Indestructibility is nice, though, to be fair, any exile effects, which it seems like we're probably going to get a few exile effects, and we already have exile effects in Standard. So, there is exile effects and stat reduction spells that can specifically take care of this card pretty easily. However, that last ability of the card, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, that is a really, really good ability. I could see that being a very popular ability in either mid-range creature-based builds, even in token-based decks, just being able to have essentially get a wide token base and then play Toski Bearer Secrets, attacking with all your tokens and draw at least two, maybe even two or more cards. That's pretty absurd. So, if there was ever a way to give this creature flash in a standard format, then I would say the card would be legit nutty. But as the moment, I think it's a good card. I still am kind of laughing that a lot of people kind of thought the card was busted. Okay, look. I know that I am also tired of push green cards as much as the Nets bloke. Don't get me wrong, we're even going to be probably talking about one in about a few minutes from now. Or, well, not less than a few minutes, probably a little bit in the future from now. So, I understand push green cards being frustrating. This is not a push green card. It's a good card. It is going to be fun. It's flavorful, and it's also just good with the Viking theme, essentially pretty much being themed around the squirrel god, which is Raska. Look, I don't know my Norse mythology very well, so I'm going to butcher some of these names, so I apologize in advance. But still, it's just a nice flavor win, and I do think the card overall is good. I'm not sure if it will see a competitive play, but casual jank play, absolutely. Also, just the fact you can mutate on this is also just lovely as well. So it'll be kind of fun to do the mutate-based shenanigans with this card. Next up, a card that actually got spoiled before the day before the spoiler. Some people thought this was originally a leak. That was not the case. There was this promo material that a lot of content creators got, which were essentially just a Kaldhiem promo package, more or less, to advertise for the reveal stream. And it included this card, which is a saga. As we already know, sagas are returning to Kaldhiem. For those who don't know how sagas work, if this is the first time they're watching this video, sagas essentially are an enchantment that when they enter the battlefield, you do the first step on the card, and then at the beginning of each of your following turns, when you essentially go for your upkeep and draw a card, you then activate the second ability by putting a lore counter on it. So, what this is essentially Invasion of the Giants. It's a saga that is Izzet colors, aka red and blue. That's very good. And it has 3 steps in the saga. Step 1. When you play it, you're going to scry 2. Then your next turn, after you draw your card, you're then going to draw another card. draw a card, and then you may reveal a giant card from your hand. When you do, Invasion of the Giant, specifically the enchantment itself, is going to deal 2 damage to a target opponent or planeswalker. Pretty good. And then the step 3, that's going to happen in the following turn. The next giant, or whenever you put the next counter on it, the next giant spell you cast this turn costs 2 less to cast. I'm going to say this, as I already said before, I do kind of adore this card. This card is actually a really, really sweet card. Now, obviously they're trying to encourage Izzet Giant Tribal, since that's kind of like the realm they came from, the pretty much Izzet realm in the Kaldhiem. By the way, I can't remember all the names of the realms in Kaldhiem, so I'm just going to call them by their guild's equivalent, for the record. And the Giant Realm is pretty much the Izzet Realm, as I like to call it. So it's pretty much Frost and Lava Giants, essentially. So, as the card itself, it's pretty much a combination of a Preordain with a shock that can shock that's either going to target the opponent of the planeswalker that they control, and stat reduction for giant spells, because you're only going to most likely play this card in a giant tribal deck. Now, to be fair, if you want to make an argument for this not being in a giant tribal deck, if we just ignore the third step and all the giant aspects of it, this is still a 2-mana scry 2 and then essentially draw a second card draw a second card on your next upkeep for red and blue, which is pretty good. Just on those base stats alone, a Preordain that essentially can be a shock to your opponent's face, that's really good. Now, if you go into Giant Tribal with this, that's where we get to a whole nother story. One of the most popular cards in the format is Bonecrusher Giant. We all know that. So being able to, say, play this on turn 2, and then turn 3, you can just reveal your Bonecrusher Giant to essentially then just shock your opponent's face, and then stomp something that you might need to stomp, whether it's the opponent's face or planeswalker or creature, etc. And then on the following turn, making your Bonecrusher Giant only cost 1 mana with its stat reduction. That is pretty nutty. That is actually really, really good. Plus, we also have a lot of really powerful giants that are already in the format, with the catch-22 of them being tricky to play because they're giants, they actually have a high converted mana cost, such as like Fritz the Sudden Storm I could think of, and also stuff like even Realm Cloak Giant if you go into the Jeskai colors and such. Being able to have this card out on the play to be able to reduce the cost of those giant spells so they can be a lot more manageable, or at the very least be manageable that you can cast both the giant portion of the spell and either hold up mana for either combat tricks / also maybe counterspell magic. That's really good. I don't think I can't underrate this. That stat reduction part of the saga, if you go into Giant Tribal, is very, very nice. Also, one thing to keep note, since we know changelings are coming into the set, this also can reduce the cost of changeling spells, since technically changelings are giants, so you gotta keep that in mind. Nevertheless, I am going to give this kind of like a high... If, like, for example, I forgot to give the score for Toski, I would give Toski like a 7 out of 10. Good card, but it's going to be fringe play. Well, I would say Invasion of the Giants, I'd give it... If we're playing it in a giant deck, it's definitely a 9 out of 10. If we're not playing it in a giant deck and we're just only taking advantage of the scry and drawing a card without the shock component since we don't have a giant in our deck design, then probably a 6. But if we're in the giant deck, it's like a 9. Next up, we actually get revealed one of the new planeswalkers that's coming from the set, which is Niko Aris. They're actually a very fascinating planeswalker. So they came from Pharaohs, they have some enchantment shenanigans, but they also have some athletic shard shenanigans. So it's X, white, blue, blue. Keep in mind, the loyalty's at 3, so you can cast this for 3 mana or more. But when they enter the battlefield, they create X shard tokens. And for the record, since I'm showing the borders version, what a shard token is essentially it's a enchantment permanent that has the ability that you can sacrifice it for 2 mana to scry 1 and then draw a card, just for the record. Now, they have the activated abilities of +1. Up to 1 target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. Whenever that creature deals damage this turn, return it to the owner's hand. -1. Niko Aris deals 2 damage to target tapped creature for each card you draw in this turn. And then -1, create the shard token that the first ability can do. And they have free loyalty. I think this is going to be the sleeper card of the set. I think a lot of people kind of will look at this and they just will look at the activated abilities on this and just think, well, the -1 is semi-protection, but the problem is the opponent creature has to be tapped, and I guess you could technically do it to your own creatures, but why would you want to do that? Well, besides hint, hint, wink, wink, nod, brash taunter, but just a little hint there, if you want to do it like that. Just saying. But anyway, and then just the +1 up to 1 target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. Okay, that could be very nifty, but bouncing into our hand when we deal damage, that seems a little off. And then -1 just to create a shard token? Don't get me wrong, shard tokens are nice, but why is this card good? This card is good because it's both an early game card and also a late game card. Specifically, the fact that you can cast this on turn 3, activate any of those abilities if they're relevant, very nice. Like, remember, a lot of people are playing aggro decks at the moment. Like, they will play like a pretty much Bushfire, I always get the name of it wrong, Brushfire Elemental, attack you in the face on turn 2. Like, there's a lot of aggro decks like that will be aggressive on turn 1 and turn 2. So being able to play this just on turn 3, and then a majority of them have 1 or 2 health. So being able to essentially just -1 if you need to just essentially get rid of an early game creature, that's something to not underestimate. I'm just going to be frank. Also, there is a chance that this can also be good in the mid-game and such, because those abilities are still relevant. Like, let's say you cast your own creature. I think a lot of people don't realize that this creature, or this Planeswalker's +1 is very powerful with ETB creatures. Or even adventure creatures, keep that in mind. Like, let's say, for example, let's say we're playing this in Jeskai Giants, as I mentioned before. Let's say you play Bone Crusher Giant on, like, you play Stomp on turn 2, play the Giant on turn 3, and then on turn 4, you could play Niko, essentially. Play Niko Aris on turn 4, get 1 shard out of it, which is nice because you can use that as card draw / scribe for later. And then you can just +1 the Bone Crusher Giant, which then you won't get dealt damage because of the factor that it's a activated ability that's targeting it, not a spell. And then when the Bone Crusher deals 4 unblockable damage, which is nice, you return it back to your hand, which then gives you another activation of the Stomp Adventure spell, as well as just recasting it and being able to be an evasive attacking creature. There's also good powerful ETB creatures, such as Charming Prince. Like, there's a lot of cheeky things you can do with this card with the +1. And -1, honestly, is perfectly okay for the card. Like, there are sometimes where you're playing a control matchup, and you mostly want to actually do resource generation rather than just trying to build board presence or get in for damage and such. So just being able to create those little shard tokens, which, by the way, since their enchantments do activate with auras, with not auras, brain fart. They activate with Constellation Matter type cards. Don't underrate that. I think there's one really cool thing about this Planeswalker coming from Pharaohs is just the factor that it's kind of like a good hint, wink, wink, nod, nod. Hey, you know those constellation mechanics that were in Pharaohs? Here's a Planeswalker that synergizes well with those. Wink, wink, hint, hint, nod, nod, etc., etc., etc. So just that is pretty nice. And even then, this Planeswalker late game is also really good, because the thing is, Ets can be anything. Like, if late game you don't have really anything to do and you need a mana sink, just being able to put Ets into this and just create like 1, 2, 3, 4 shard tokens, which then can be used for late game draw, nothing to underrate. Also, I will say this: if there's a Planeswalker that is absurd with the Liverform engine, this one. This card is absurd with the Liverform engine, because one, it has an ETB effect, which granted is a triggered ability, which then you could copy with Liverform engine. Also, the activated abilities can be triggered with Liverform engine, and then when you use the scrying and sacking from the shard tokens, yet again, you can copy those with the Liverform engine. So that's one thing to not underrate about this card. Neverall, I think they're a very powerful Planeswalker for the format. Don't sleep on this. This card is really, really good. Plus, also, I think in Oathbreaker, it's just a nutty card. Like, I think Oathbreaker players are going to love this card. So if you see a lot of Niko Aris builds in Oathbreaker once this comes out, don't be surprised. It's just a really good card for the format in general. And it's one of those cards where I like it because, yes, it is good for control decks, but it's actually a very modular card. Like, you can have it in mid-range, like aggro decks. You can put it in control decks. And you can even put it in aggro decks, because a lot of aggro decks do want to have their creatures to be able to attack in, and the +1 for that is pretty nice. Yet again, control decks will like it, because you get the shards, which is card draw and scry, but also the -1 is not bad. So, overall, honestly, I'm going to give this card a 10 out of 10. I think this card is really, really good. Don't sleep on it. This card is going to probably see a lot of play. And I love the card, and it's not as annoying as the free cost Teferi. Which, whew, thank you for that. Thank you for not an annoying Azorius Planeswalker. Much obliged. Plus, also, both the borderless art and the regular art is legit. Next up, we actually get a god, but also we get a Planeswalker, because it's an NDFC. Technically, it's... let's actually do the showcase art, because the showcase art is pretty legit. We got Valki, God of Lies, 1 in the black, legendary creature god. But we also have, when it flips, it's actually coincidentally Valki, a Planeswalker impersonating Valki, which the Planeswalker is our classic Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter, for 7 mana. Okay, we'll talk about both sides. We'll do the front side first, and then I'll talk about the back side. And yes, I will get this out of the way. The fact that this can, you can both cast the front portion or the back portion of this card makes this good, like all NDFC cards do, so yes, that is the popular thing about the card. Keep that in mind. Nevertheless, Valki, God of Lies. 1 in a black for a legendary creature god. It's a 2/1. And then when Valki enters the battlefield, each opponent reveals their hand. For each opponent, exile a creature card they revealed this way until Valki leaves the battlefield. Okay, so it's kind of like a temporary divest. Okay. But it also has Ets, choose a creature card, exile with Valki with converted mana cost Ets, and then Valki becomes a copy of that card. Okay, I will say this is actually a pretty cheeky card in Eternal formats, mostly the ones that are popular with a certain card called Uro. Because the cheekiest thing you could do with this card is just play this on turn 2, exile the Uro they obviously have because they're wanting to try to play it on turn 3, and then your turn 3, you can actually make it into Uro, and then attack in with Uro triggers. That is probably going to be the cheekiest use in Eternal formats that Uro is legal in, that people are going to try to play this card. So, this could just be the tech card against Uro, if I'm just being honest there. But nevertheless, this is still a pretty decent 2-drop. Like, okay, yes, it's technically temporarily, and technically... Well, I'm not going to try to say technically too much, but... The problem with this card is this is a card that essentially is the equivalent of getting pretty much has Bolt Snap removal right on it, essentially, because the minute you exile their key card that they want to do for their plan, they're just going to automatically just remove it like that. So, you gotta keep that in mind. But, still, being able to temporarily stall their plans and then having to essentially fish mana to essentially remove this so they can get the card back, that stalling is nothing to underestimate. Also, the fact that you can become a copy of a creature is pretty nice because this is both decent early game, but also can be really, really, really good late game. Because let's think about it. Let's say late game, you're all kind of like top decking, they draw their card, and then they can't probably play it yet. Maybe it's like a 5-cost creature and they have 4 mana, so maybe like mid-late game, I guess. Then you play this, you exile a card from their hand, and then if you have essentially, if they don't have top deck the removal, then you can become a copy. Or maybe they have a free drop that they were wanting to hold because, oh hey, it's an adventure spell. Well, on the other hand, they're probably just going to cast the adventure spell before you look at their hand. But you kind of see where we're coming from here. Late game, you can exile cards from their hand, and then the activated ability becomes a lot more easier to activate. So, also, one thing to not underestimate with this card. Pretty much, remember it doesn't say sorcery speed. So you can actually do this transformation effect at instant speed. that is nothing to underestimate. Because let's say, for example, let's say you essentially decide to, I don't know. Let's say you decide to steal 1-drop, 0 free. Like, let's say something like that. So then you do that just to get a card out of their hand, and then they try to shock the card to remove it so they can get their card back. Well, if you have the 1 mana floating, change it to 0 free as they have the target spell in the stack. Hey, you save Valki. Cool. Now, I do think this card will be a lot more better in kind of like Flicker decks or Reanimator decks that are using cards like Lurrus or Madness or Return of the Dark Dwellers, essentially, because then you could just return this from your graveyard to the battlefield and then do the ETB effect. I just think this side of the card is just very powerful. Like, it's one of those cards that doesn't look as good when you look at it at first glance, but I think this card is going to be a little bit more annoying than people will take at first glance. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. And now let's talk about the side that everybody probably wants me to talk about. Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter. This is the back side. Costs 7 mana. Legendary Planeswalker Tibalt. As Tibalt enters the battlefield, you get an emblem with, you may play cards exiled with Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter, and you may spend mana and still with mana of any color to cast those spells. And then it has an activated ability of +2, exile the top card of each player's library, -3, exile target artifact or creature, or -8, exile all cards from all graveyards, add free red pips of mana. And it has 5 loyalty. What do I feel about Tibalt? Honestly, I kind of love it. I can't. Like, okay, it's a little bit of bias. I'm going to say this. There's a little bit of bias in here, but I actually kind of adore this card. One, the flavor is on point. Like, so many people were predicting that Tibalt was going to be the Loki equivalent in Kaldhiem, and the fact that he is literally impersonating as the Trickster God, or at least the Kaldheim's equivalent of the Trickster God, that is legit awesome. That is like a legit flavor win there. Okay, so let's just get that out of the way. And as for the backside of itself, it's actually a pretty good ability in control decks, I'm not going to lie. Just being able to get that emblem right off the back and be able to essentially exile a target artifact creature, perfectly fine. And then you get the emblems, which means then you can actually recast a spell under your control, which then kind of gives it kind of like a mind control-ish like effect. Like, this is kind of like a Nicol Bolas style card on a Tibalt, which is kind of hilarious if I'm being honest. And just being able to both, just then if you don't need to remove anything, just +2, exile both top of your cards, and then essentially be able to be cast, keyword cast. So one thing to keep in mind with this card, oh wait, you can play cards, so you can actually play lands from Tibalt. That's actually kind of funny, because that means then if you're missing a land spell and then you +2 and actually get a land from the opponent, you can actually play that. That's, okay, that's actually pretty good. That's actually really good. So, yeah. Just the +2, being able to generate... Remember, +2 essentially here is drawing 2 cards, where granted 1 card is yours and 1 card is your opponent. Or +2, if you're playing this in a commander format, +2 draw about 4-ish cards, which is pretty legit. Okay, that's actually really legit. And then -8, the ultimate graveyard hate, and just getting a little bit of mana back is really nice. And then you can use that mana to cast any powerful card from your opponent's graveyard that you would want to cast. Yeah, I'm going to admit it. I like this card a lot. Now, I will say the one catch of this card, and I think many people are going to miss it, 7 mana is a lot for this ability. Like, it's still a good ability in control decks. And we are in a format where ramp is still very popular. Like, we're literally in a format where we can cast Ugins, for Pete's sakes. So this card can be cast in our format. So, just in standard, keep that in mind. But, it's just one of those cards where I think really the way you have to look at this card, legitimately honest, is yes, best case mentality, if you can just +2 constantly, just exile, play stuff, it's insane. But at its base, you just have to look at it as 7 mana, remove a problematic artifact or creature, which granted, we do have problematic, well, not problematic, we have powerful artifacts in the format, we have powerful creatures in the format, so just 7 mana, essentially 7 mana, exile it, and then next turn you can cast it if it's beneficial to your game plan. That's a very powerful effect. And the factor is, this card is not a dead card in your hand because, boo, you can actually cast it as Valki, God of the Lies, and still get the semi-really good effects of being able to semi-steal your opponent's stuff, so to speak. So, overall, Valki, God of Lies, and Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter, I think it's good. I think it's going to be a card that is... As much as my love is going to say it, I don't think it's good as, like, Niko Aris is good. But I still like the card, so I'm still going to give it a high score of, like, 7.5. I think it's a really good card, but I don't know if it's a meta-defining busted card. Do I love the card? Yes. But I don't think it's going to be a meta-breaker card. I think it's going to be a fun card to play. I do think this is a card that we'll see play in Rakdos style or even Mardu style control decks as a finisher card, or as a way to stall by playing the God portion. I know some people want me to make the joke of being like, this should be a 10, or go on the complete opposite of being like, oh, this should be a 1 since the previous Tibalts were terrible, other than the one from War of the Spark, but realistically, I think it's a 7.5. I think this card is good, but I think it's very good in specific archetypes, and it is one of those cards where it does have weaknesses that you gotta keep in mind. But still, Rakdos getting what essentially amounts to removal that becomes later mind control by just casting whatever artifact or permanent you exile, or even instant sorcery if you do the plus. Don't underrate that ability. That ability is really, really good. So, overall, love the card. It's definitely going to see some play, but I don't think it's going to be like a meta... It's not going to be a meta breaker. Let me put it like that. Next up, a really actually interesting card, Inga Rune-Eyes. 3 and a blue for a legendary creature, human wizard, at uncommon, so we are getting the uncommon legendaries again, which is pretty sweet. And it has, when this creature enters the battlefield, scry free, which is, scry free is really good. Just don't underrate that. Scry free is a pretty good effect. And then when this creature dies, draw 3 cards if 3 or more creature died this turn. So definitely with the free themes, and especially with the power and toughness being 3/3. Every path ever charted by an Omen Seeker is etched into our eyes. Good flavor text. So, what do I think of this card? This is an interesting card. I'm going to say that right off the bat. This is one of those cards that at first glance you don't really think is that amazing. I mean, a 4 mana for a free, that's not really good stats. But scrying free is not bad. Like, an obvious inclusion, like if we're talking, like if we go a little bit back in Commander for Commander Legends, yes, you're probably going to play this in the one Commander that anytime you scry, you actually draw those cards. Like, this is probably an auto-include in that deck. Or at least a really good inclusion at the very least. But I think the one thing that people are going to underrate at first, because they think it's not much possible, is that last ability. When this creature dies, draw 3 cards if 3 or more creatures died this turn. That is actually very fascinating because that is kind of like a board wipe insurance policy on this card. So you can cast this on turn 4. If your opponent's going to have a Shadow of the Sky or any like mass destruction spells, then you can have Inga Rune-Eyes on the battlefield as just an insurance policy if you're playing this like in a token or a mid-range creature-oriented deck design to be like, hey, if I have at least 3 creatures on the battlefield or more, I am going to draw 3 cards if you do the board wipe. And the opponent would then have to ask themselves if they want to do that. So in Commander, as well as in like Standard, in creature/token-oriented deck designs, I think the card's pretty good. Here's the problem, though. The problem I think this card's going to face is that we have a lot, and I mean a lot, of exile spells in the format. There's more coming into the format. We have ones that are already popular in the format. As well, this is mostly only good against board wipe spells. This format, at least currently Standard at the moment, is very popular with a lot of targeted removal spells. I mean, we have stuff like Heartless Act, Shocks, etc. We're even getting more targeted removal spells in the format. So, I think this is one of those cards where I think it's interesting, but I don't know if it's good. I think it's going to be one of those that people give it a shot. I think it's definitely a decent limited card at the very least. It's one of those weird kind of like draft cards where it's like, it's mostly legendary just to be balanced, more or less, and it's just a flavor because it's a new character from the realm. But just when we go into constructed standard and just constructed commander, it's a maybe, but I am not really that high on the card. I do think you should not underrate the factor that it can be a board wipe insurance policy. Maybe even if you're playing this in blue-white control and you have board presence and such, and you just play this down and be like, hey, be careful of building up your board presence and such, or else, oh, wait a minute, it's not free creatures you control, it's any creatures. Okay, I have to actually think on this one. So let's say you have 2 creatures, your opponent has 2 creatures, or 1 creature, then you do your board what? Okay, I'm actually going to be a little bit higher on this card. Because I forgot that it's not creatures you just control, it's also creatures your opponents control. So it's even, at least if you have an insurance policy of at least 2 creatures other than Inga Rune-Eyes, or at least have 1 more creature and your opponent has another creature and you do the board wipe or they do the board wipe. Actually, yeah, that makes this card actually a lot more decent. I was originally going to give this like a 6 out of 10, but I'm going to be a lot more optimistic. I think I'm going to give it about a 6.5 out of 10. I know it's not higher than the previous one, but I do think it is a pretty decent card. Also, this in party decks is actually going to be pretty cool, so keep that in mind, because it is a wizard, so if you need a wizard for your party deck, or if you need a wizard for your wizard tribal deck, well, here you go. So overall, with that in mind, yeah, I think it's a 6.5 out of 10, because the problem is exile spells / targeted removal spells are very popular in the format at the moment, and it can kind of kill the momentum of this card. In Commander, though, I can see it. I can see this in Commander. I will say, though, the alternate art for this is... Okay. Next up, a card that is pretty good. Sigrid, I believe is how you pronounce it. The God Favored. 1 and 2 white for a legendary creature, human warrior. It has flash. It's a 2/2. And it also has first strike and protection from god creatures. That's pretty good. But also has, when this creature enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target attacking or blocking creature until Sigrid leaves the battlefield. This card is legit good. This card is really good. Especially in this format. Because here's the thing. I know many people are going to make the argument of stuff like, oh wait, what about like Skyclave Apparition? Isn't Skyclave Apparition a better card? Yes and no. Yes, Skyclave targets more fiends, but I think the flash ability of this card is the thing that people are going to underrate a lot. Because here's the thing. The fact that you can use this as a combat trick to be both exile their bigger thing that's attacking, and then you can block with this because it has first strike, they're smaller creatures. So then when they attack, she will have the combat advantage with the first strike, and then you still have a 2/2 that's still surviving, but also has protection from the god creatures. Which could be relevant since, hey, we have a 2-drop god in the format, so you gotta keep that in mind, as well as the gods from Pharaoh, so you gotta keep that in mind. And just her ability being Battlefiend Priest, really, 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 really good. And the fact that it's flash, I think that's the thing that people are underrating about this card. The flash speed on this is huge. Yes, you can only really do the exile effect when the opponent is attacking. Yes. But chances are if the opponent is attacking, you probably are going to only use this when it's the best opportune time, like you know that they're not holding up a counter magic. And even if you know they're holding up a counter magic, this being able to, say, feed into a counter spell, and then you could do like a board wipe next turn, essentially, because they won't have the counter magic up since you tried to exile one of their attacking creatures. Especially in a format where 4-mana board wipes are a thing, you should not underrate that ability. So, yeah. Good stated. Yes, it's a legendary, so you can't have multiple copies on the battlefield unless you play Historic and you play cards like Spark Devil. Which, granted, that doesn't really make much sense, since technically you would have to have Spark Devil have Flash, which you can technically do that with Leyline Anticipation, so... But I think overall, in Standard, this is just a pretty good card. Also, keep in mind, this synergizes pretty well with Niko Aris, as we mentioned before, because you could just plus on this creature, attack, and then if you have like spells to be able to remove the creature when it's coming back, you can do that, or you can just play tempo, a semi-tempo deck where yes, they're going to try to attack with their creature, and then you just flash this in. Then with Niko Aris, just make it unblockable, attack, put it back to your hand, and then just hold up the mana for essentially when they try to attack with another higher powerful creature. I think this interaction with the new Niko Planeswalker is nothing to underrate. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. So, I'm going to be honest. This is a 9 out of 10. This card is just really, really good. I think you're going to see this card see a lot of play. Yes, it's not as good as Skyclave Apparition, but it's still pretty good. Plus, yet again, the alternate art, sick. Next up, probably one of the better, it's surprising how many good Boros Commander cards we've been getting lately. Koll, the Forgemaster, red and a white, so just a 2/2 for 2, legendary creature Dwarf Warrior, and it has a few static effects. 1. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, if it was enchanted or equipped, return it to its owner's hand. That's really good. Oh, and also creature tokens you control that are enchanted or equipped get +1/+1. It's really, really, really good. Boros Commander players are going to love this because mostly the Boros have been, through Commander Legends, as well as just been, even in Zendikar Horizon, have been encouraged to do the equipment's tribal matter decks, like with stuff like with Akiri, as well as I'm forgetting the Kaldhiem legendary that came from Commander Legends. Somebody might remind me in the comments, but essentially, this is just a Akiri as well as that, as well as this guy, just goes all in into the equipment deck. This also in Standard is just insane, because the thing is, we have cards like, for example, from Zendikar Rising, where it's like, oh, warriors you control that are equipped have double strike. And just being able to have this card out and play in the equipment deck and just have it as an insurance policy that when somebody tries to target removal, one of your creatures that are equipped, and then essentially when that happens, then you can just return it to your hand. Plus also the insurance policy on your creatures if you attach auras to them, which is legit really cool. And just the factor that one of the weird things with equipments in general is you don't really want to attach them to token creatures unless there's a beneficial synergy. But the fact that this provides a beneficial lore-type synergy on tokens that get equipped or enchanted, legit awesome. So overall, this card's good. I mean, it's not like the most amazing card in the world, but in Commander, it's amazing. In Standard, it definitely has some good applications in the Warrior, Equipment Matter, Tribal, or Synergy decks, which, you know, with Nahiri, all the Warriors, this is also a Warrior, which is nice, so 8 out of 10. I think this card is really good, but it's really specifically for one deck. I will say that. It's a really good card for that deck, but it is for specifically one deck. There we go. Plus also, yet again, alternate art. Seriously, that looks like something from Star Wars. You know the artist did that intentionally. Next up, a card that I'm legit kind of spooked about. Old Growth Troll, a free green creature that's a 4/4 with trample, because why not? Oh, and whenever it dies, if it was a creature, return it to the battlefield. It's an aura enchantment with Enchant Force you control, and Enchanted Force has tap, add 2 green mana, and activated ability if one and tap it, sacrifice this land, create a tapped 4/4 green troll warrior creature token with trample. It's good. It's pretty pushed. But there are some weaknesses to the card. First of all, this trigger here, has to be a die trigger. So while this is good insurance against a lot of early game spot removal in the format, stuff like your Heartless Axe, your Lava Coil type cards, since it has to deal 4 damage to this, or like even against Death Touch creatures and such. The problem is, as stated before, as I say with other creatures, we have a lot of exile spells in the format and coming into the format. So the factor is this can be easily exiled, so you kinda have to keep that in mind. Like, this could be Banishing Light and you don't get the effect. This can be Elspeth Conquers Death. This can be Extinction Event, etc., etc. That being said, still, a free mana 4/4 with Trample is a very aggressive-oriented creature. And pretty much the Gruul archetype, which, by the way, the Troll Realm seems to be the Gruul tribal archetype. They like to go face, they like to go aggro, they're going to play this card, even though mostly you might probably only want to play this in mono-green decks, realistically, because of the free color pips. But still, a 4/4 Trample, that gives a pretty decent evasion, plus we also have cards that synergize with Trample in the format, so you gotta keep that in mind. And just having the Assurance policy that if somebody does targeted removal on this card, you can then enchant one of your forests, which you probably are playing if you're trying to get the free green mana pips on this, to be able to make it so that you can ramp into bigger spells later down the line. That's pretty good. Like, that's a 9 out of 10 good. This is a really pushed card. It's probably going to see play, especially in the aggro-oriented decks. Is it a questing beast? No, but it's still a really, really good card. But yes, exile spells do kill this card pretty significantly. Next up, a card that took some convincing, but I actually think this card's actually a lot more better than I took at first glance. Mass Vandal, 1 the green for a creature shapeshifter. It's a changeling, which means it can be any creature type. Trolls, warriors, giants, so you can put this in any of those tribal decks, or your cat and dog decks, so keep that in mind. And then when this card enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. Now, I had to admit, this was a card that I was kind of scratching my head at first, because I was like, is this card good? And then I remembered that there were cards like Banishing Light in the format, and I was like, oh yeah, this is actually pretty legit good, because the factor is you exile it, so the opponent can't recast it, which is nice. Plus, also, if you're playing this in a Gagari type deck, you are going to probably easily have creatures in the graveyard, so you can activate this ability of exiling a card from your graveyard. Plus, it's also 2 mana, so you can play this in like an Absent deck with Lurrus and such and recast it from your graveyard. Granted, you're probably going to have to exile a creature card that's in the graveyard, but if you're playing Absent, you're probably playing a mill type strategy where you're milling cards into your graveyard, so you're going to have creature cards within your graveyard, so then you can then cast this portion and then get the exile effect. That's pretty good. And also, just being a 2 mana on curve, whatever tribal matters that you have at the moment, if tribal matters within your deck design, that's also pretty good for a common. So, I still think it's a tech card. It's still a tech card, so I'm still going to give it kind of like the tech card rating, which for me it's like a 7 out of 10. Well, nah, not 7. I would say, yeah, okay, I changed my mind. It's a 7 out of 10. It's good, but it's really only good as a tech card. Okay, let's move on up. A bada beep, bada boop. Do 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 da do. Let's see what's next. Ooh, a Moto flip card. That's a god. Neat. We're gonna talk about Alrund, God of the Cosmos. A 5 mana legendary creature god. This creature gets +1/+1 for each card in your hand and each foretold card you own in exile. Also, at the beginning of your end step, choose a card type, then reveal the top 2 cards of your library, put all cards of the chosen type into your hand, and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. And it can also be Hakka, Whispering Raven. 1 in the blue for a legendary creature bird with flying. It's a 2/3, and then whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, return it to its owner's hand, then scry a 2. Okay, I think this is the first one where I think I will talk about the back portion of the card before I talk about the front portion. So yes, this is a Stormcrow that can return itself, so yes, unsummoned skulls, you got yourself a Stormcrow that is unsummoned, so hey, hint hint, wink wink, Unsummoned Skull is a Twitch channel, and we kind of make a joke that anytime we see a bounce spell that it's an Unsummoned Skull card, so yeah, you pretty much got your card that's a Stormcrow that returns itself. But I do think this card still is pretty decent. Like, if you just only cast this portion of the card, I think this is actually a pretty decent card in the Azorius Flyers deck. Yes, it does return to the hand, which is kind of stinky, but you really don't mind recasting it if you need to, especially if you have spells that whenever you cast a flying creature do blah. And then there are haste enablers that you could give this haste if you need to, so keep that in mind. Also, though, just being able to, whenever deal combat damage to a player, just to return it, but scrying 2. Scrying 2 is actually a pretty powerful ability, especially in the flying tribal deck, because being able to scry to get into more flyers, which then builds up your board presence, that is nothing to underestimate. So I think in flying, like, yes, this is going to be a card that probably control decks will play, because a 2-mana 2 for you flying is a pretty defensive-oriented creature, and when you can have the chance to attack, bounce, and then recast as a blocker, that's really nice, so it has a semi-vigilance ability to it. Plus, then it also has the ability that if you don't want it to be the bird anymore, you can have it become the god, which the god itself, I don't know. I think this is one of those cards where I think it's good, but you have to be kind of like a control a mid-range deck. Like, remember when I said before, I feel like the backside is really good for, like, flagging tribal and such? The problem is when you do the front portion of this card, you really want to have at least either A, a decent amount of Foretold cards cast that are pretty much not even cast, like still in the Foretold exile position, and cards in your hand to actually make it a decent stat, which then the problem is you're mostly wanting to play that in the control deck, so both sides kind of both conflict with one another, but they also have a weird synergy. And the weird synergy is if, let's say you have this out and then you have a second of this card and then you can cast the bird portion. The fact that the bird portion of the card can attack in and scry too, so you know which top cards are, so you can just keep those on top, and then when you do the end step, you can choose, say, for example, let's say you see 2 lands on top, and you're like, okay, I'm going to say lands. And then you just reveal your 2 lands, put those lands into your hand, which then works as semi-card draw. That's pretty good. And yes, of course, I would be remiss to not talk about the flavor of this being Odin, as well as I'm gonna get Aziel and all the people who are good in Viking Norse mythology, because I think this is a combination of 2 gods, but I'm not well versed in that, so I don't want to butcher my talking of it. But it's a very good flavor win on that one. So I think the card is good, but it's kind of one of those weird, I don't know how good. I think it's one of those that's either can be like a 6 out of 10 good, but it can also be an 8 out of 10 good in specific metas. So it's kind of one of those cards that kind of can tip the scale. I think a majority of the time people are going to want to cast it as the bird, but I will not underestimate the factor that the 5-cost ability on this card is the 5-cost creature card is really, really, really good in the right archetypes. So, keep that in mind. It's a cool god card, cool flavor win. It has some cool implications if you play it. Next up, well, we know elves were coming and we were wanting to get some good elf creatures. This is a good elf creature. Elvish Warmaster, 1 in the green for a 2/2 elf warrior, so that's good for party. Oh, and by the way, whenever 1 or more elves enter the battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. This ability triggers only once each turn. Mostly that's just so you don't do busted shenanigans with this card. So pretty much, if you have constant way of generating elves, you can constantly generate 1 elf token a turn. Oh, and it has an activated ability of 7 mana. Elves you control get +2/+2 and gain Death Touch until end of turn, which don't underrate Death Touch. This card is really, really good. Like, if you want to make Elf Tribal, this is going to be an auto-include as a 2-drop, because just the factor that you can have this as a 2-drop that has to be answered as soon as possible. If not, then every time you cast an Elf spell, you're going to get more Elf tokens, which help token generate to create a wide board split presence. And then has a late-game activate ability of gaining Death Touch, which then makes them really hard to block and such. That's really good. You can also do some cute synergies with this in, like, the Death Touch tribal deck, essentially, that plays like that snake that essentially anytime you attack with a Death Touch creature, you drain your opponent 1 life. That's also really cute. This is also a card you can return with Luris. That's also really good. Just, overall, this card is really, really good. Like, this is a really good 2-drop. Yes, it dies to a lot of removal, dies to shock, everything, but the fact that this is just a really overall good early game creature as well can be used late game to help generate more board presence. Like, let's say on turn 4, you have like 2 creature cards, you have this, and then just get an elf spell. You can late game just cast this, cast an elf spell, and then get an elf token out of it. Pretty nice. Will also be really nice if we have like flash elves in the format, or if we have like instant speed elf spells, which I think we do have one in the Fiend Booster. So then, which will generate more elves on your opponent's turn. Just, I mean, if we get like an elf squirrel nets, then this card is officially nutty. Like, if we get elf squirrel nets, then this card is officially nutty. But as is, it's a really good card. It's an 8 out of 10. Another push green rare. Who would have thought? Next up, mention that the elves are technically Golgari, so this is their saga, which Binding of the Old Gods. 2 and Golgari for a uncommon saga. It has step 1, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Okay, just that alone, it gives this card an 8 out of 10. Just unconditional 4 mana, unconditional removal is good. But you also have the second step of the saga, which is search your library for a forest card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. That's ramp. Also, remember, we have landfall cards in the format, so this can actually help trigger landfall. Like stuff with Lotus Cobra and such. And also, we do have some certain cards that we're going to be talking about soon that can be tutored out with this card. So in multicolored decks, this could actually be pretty legit. Oh, and then the last step, creature control gain Death Touch until end of turn. As stated before, if you're playing Death Touch Tribal, this last step it's actually going to be a lot more beneficial. But here's the thing. I can ignore the ramp and the third step. Yes, the third step is the least exciting aspect of it, all things considered, with the exception in some specific deck archetypes. But just 4 mana, destroy anything that is problematic, a problematic enchantment, a problematic card, a problematic planeswalker, creature. Just being able to go, you're gone, and then just have all those other abilities, it's just icing on the cake. So, this is a 8 out of 10 card. I'm even almost wanting to say it's a 9 out of 10 card. It's really good. It will see play. It's an enchantment, so it can be returned back with spells. It can also affect Constellation. It also can affect landfall triggers. It's a really, really dang good card. Plus, also the wood coloring on this is just legit. Victor Adam Manguez, you did really good with the art on this. A+. I now sound like a cheesy art teacher. Okay, let's start talking about this. Snow basics are back. Okay, let's talk about my opinion on snow basics. Here's the thing. There's one half of me that's happy that snow basics are back because, one, it is a good flavor for Kaldhiem since it is the snow plane. And I also like it for people who do need snow islands within their deck designs if they do like snow tribal synergies and such. I just kind of wish that there was just snow like either dual cards, which we're going to talk about in a minute, or like DFC cards essentially snow. I didn't really want snow basics because if snow becomes a dominant archetype in the meta, then it just only makes sense to play snow lands. And it kind of cuts out your deck building variety if you want to try out like other like cards. Like let's say all the basic lands that we got like from Jumpstart or even from future sets, if you like the art on it, you'll be like, oh, I want to customize with this art, but I'm playing the snow deck, so I really gotta have the snow lands only, which kind of suck. I'm just gonna say that, just by that perspective alone, it kind of sucks. I kind of gave my response to this as using the Bob's Burgers meme, where it's like, it's fine, but I'm going to complain about it during the whole thing, and that's pretty much going to be my thing. I'm probably going to complain that, oh great, probably for the next 1.5 to 2 years, it probably will make sense as long as I'm playing a dominant snow deck meta. If snow becomes a dominant meta deck design, that it only makes sense to play the snow lands from Kaldhiem. I will say, though, one rebuttal, if this is a way to actually give them an excuse to actually put on sale the Eldraine Winter Wonderland Snowlands, that would be kind of cool. Arena, wink wink, nod nod, hint hint. That being said, I will say all the Snowlands that we've seen so far, gorgeous art. The artist did really good on them. I just don't like basic snow lands as a mechanic, in my personal opinion. Now, one thing I will go, since we're talking about snow, let's see, did they have it? Oh, they don't actually show it yet. I thought they would show it. Hang on, we're going to do a little post-live editing here. I'm actually going to go to Mythic Spoiler for this. One moment. Okay, we're going to go to Mythic Spoiler because I know they showed it there. Because I do feel like it would be remiss if we didn't talk about the other part of the snow mechanic. The one part of the snow, though, that I do like, that I actually legit adore, is this cycle of snow dual tap lands. Sorry about the ad on the side, and the ad on the bottom. But essentially, Woodland Chasm. It's a swamp forest, you can tap it for green or black, Woodland Chasm enters battlefield tap. And they have this for all the guild colors. Now this is snow land I can get behind. I love it because it's a good budget land option. I like it because it can be fetchable since it's a swamp and a forest, so you can fetch it with any fetch land type cards that you have in the format, or like with the Gagari enchantment that we talked about earlier, or any cards that can fetch a specific land type. That makes this card really good. And it's just a really, really good budget land option. If you have synergies that are like, you need to have a swamp or a forest in play. Like we were talking about that Troll Warrior earlier, and let's say you're wanting to play a multicolored deck. Well, hey, this is like, maybe you're playing Gagari Trolls, which granted, maybe you don't want to play Gagari Trolls, but let's say you do that. Let's say that's something you want to try out. Then you can actually play Woodland Chasm and still get the forest portion of it so that you can still synergize with that Troll Die trigger. Just little things like that. And just, yes, technically we still have the game lands in the format that are probably the better alternative to this. But if you're playing a snow tribal deck, or if you're playing a deck that synergizes with swamp or forest-based mechanics, or like land-ish, specific landfall-ish mechanics, like specific forest fall, swamp fall, etc., then this budget alternative option is really, 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 really good. Like, it's good enough that I'm giving it a 10 out of 10. And giving it my budget, amazing. Like, I don't know what I would give it, cheesy. I would probably just give it the budget win of the day, because this is so great for people who are starting Arena through Kaldhiem. This is great for people who are on a budget and they can't get like the special rare lands of the set and such. This is just a really good alternative budget option. I can't underrate that. And as much as I'm not going to like the snow basics, I do like that this can encourage essentially multicolor snow-based decks if it's necessary in the format. So overall, 10 out of 10. I like this. I like this as a good budget-oriented card. And yes, it does enter in tap, so don't, like, overrate them. But I still love the cards for being just a good budget option in general. And that's probably going to be the only person, you're probably going to see this being the only person that gives tapped, what essentially are guild gates, a 10 out of 10. Anyway, let's actually talk about one of the spells that do synergize with if you decide to go into the Snow Matters decks. Frostbite. 1 mana red for a snow instant. It deals 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and if you control 3 or more snow permanents, it deals 3 damage instead. I was originally 50-50 on this card, but a lot of people had kind of convinced me to actually be a lot more optimistic on this card. The reason why I don't really like this card generally at first is because most people are like, oh, this is like a better shock, isn't it? Well, yes and no. Yes, this is technically a shock that can upgrade to a bolt, which is nothing to underrate, especially if you're going to use this only as creature removal or planeswalker removal. The problem is, I think it's only going to be in the decks that specifically you only use shock as creature removal and planeswalker removal. The problem is, the reason why shock is very popular as well as stomp is because if needed, it can go to the opponent's face to finish off the opponent. This doesn't do that. You can only use this as spot removal, which is a significant weakness to the card. I don't think many people are not going to understand that until they play, and then they top deck this when they want to deal the last 2 damage to the opponent, and they don't have a creature out. But yet, if they had shock in their deck, then they could finish off the opponent. I think a lot of people are going to have those feel bads when they play this card. That being said, if you're playing this in like a creature-oriented deck design, where you're mostly wanting to finish off your opponent with creatures rather than like instant sorcery spells, then the card is legit pretty good, especially if you're in the snow deck. Because if you're in the snow deck, yeah, early game it's a shock, but later game it can be a lightning bolt, and I don't think I need to underrate how good lightning bolt is. So, yeah, pretty good in standard. As for eternal formats, maybe? The problem is, like, you could just play a lightning bolt, and you don't have to follow the snow condition to make it into a lightning bolt, and you can target lightning bolt to the face, so yet again, I don't know if this is going to replace lightning bolt in eternal formats, but in standard, as a standard constructed card, I think it's fine. Like, it's a 6 out of 10 fine. It's probably will see a lot of play, especially if people try to make the snow deck work, but I'm still not that impressed, but I can see its practicality. Now, a card that I don't think you want to underrate. Varragoth, Bloodsky Sire. 2 and a black for a demon rogue. Legendary creature, Death Touch 2 free. It has Boast, which is a new mechanic in the set. Now, what Boast essentially amounts to is when you attack with the creature, once you declare this creature as attacker, so you can activate this ability during combat, keep that in mind. So, but you only activate it once, so yeah, but still, there's some pretty powerful Boast abilities, like this one, where 1 and a black, target player searches their library for a card, then shuffle their library and puts that card on top of it. So, if you Boast with this creature and have 2 mana floating, this is a tutor for 2 mana. It's a vampiric tutor that you don't lose life that costs 2 mana. This is gross. This is really, really, really gross. It's about as gross as the fact that when you look closer at the art that it's skin flesh that they're wearing as their cloak. It's that gross. Because, here's the thing. There's a lot of cards in the format, either in Eternal or in Standard, or coming into Standard, that have the ability that when you deal combat damage or when you attack, you draw a card. So you can probably see with this going. Like, let's say you play a card that whenever a creature attacks, you draw a card. Let's say you have that. What you can do is then essentially, when that trigger goes on the stack, and you have the mana floating, you can just essentially Boast for 1 and a black, tutor for the card, put it on the top of your library, and then draw that card when you activate the draw trigger ability. That is nuts. I don't think I can underrate how nuts that ability is. Plus, we also have a lot of cheap cycling cards in the format. Keep in mind, we have cycling in the format, so you can just do play this, do the Boast, and then cycle for 1, which then free mana to tutor a very specific card. That is a Grim Tutor that you don't have to spend life on. This card is nutty. Plus, it's also a rogue, so it might actually do pretty well in the rogue decks, especially if they want to tutor out their specific kill spells or counter magic spells later down in the game. So, yeah, this is a really, really good card. And that's not even talking about that you can return this with Call of the Dark Dwellers and other cheap reanimation spells. It's just... this card is the really, really pushed black card of the set. It's really good. I'm just grateful that you can only have 1 of these on the battlefield, because it's a legendary, because if you can have more, then this card would be absolutely nuts. This card is like a 9 out of 10. It is going to see a lot of play. And even if you just tutor and do the slow tutor, and if you're not going against a mill deck, just being able to tutor for a specific card, put it on top, and then have your next turn play just pretty much automatically determine what you're going to do, whether or not you need a land or just a specific play. This card is nuts. And that's not even talking about the commander implications of this card with stuff like Opposition Agent or the politics you can do where you can be like, hey, I want to deal 2 points of damage to you, so if you want to just tutor for a card, don't worry, I don't have Opposition Agent. Kidding, I have Opposition Agent. But let's say you don't. Just the politics you can do with this card is nuts. It's a really good card. It's pushed. It's powerful. Don't underrate it. It's a 9 out of 10. The only thing that's keeping it from being a 10 out of 10 is because it's legendary. That's pretty much it. Plus, also, yet again, the alternate art. Sick. Next up, Sarulf's Packmate. Love the art. Love the love the foretell ability. Legitimately, it's a draft card which might have some popular implications. Unless you're playing Wolf Tribal, and then you might play this card. Another powerful... Actually, let's look at the borderless art for this one. A foretell card that you probably are going to keep your eye on. Alrund's Epiphany. 7 mana for sorcery, or foretell for 6, that has create 2 1/1 blue bird creature tokens with flying. Take an extra turn after this one and exile this spell. Well, on the bright side, at least they know to remember to exile their extra turn spells. Like, instead of like how they didn't do that with Nexus of Fate. It's a good card. It's a really good card. Extra turn spells are nothing to underestimate, especially in a format where we have Shark Typhoon. So if you have Shark Typhoon on the battlefield on turn 6, then you can cast this either as a turn 7 spell or just cast it for its foretell for 6 and just get a 6/6 flyer, which then you can attack in with Bird. That's just 8 power flying that you can attack with your extra turn. That's pretty nutty. If there is only a con of this card, you only will play it like in one specific type of deck, which is the control deck. The control deck that probably has some flyers. That's really the only type of deck that I see can play this card. Not really. I don't see this being played like in an aggro deck or mid-range deck. But still, an extra turn spell, never underrate extra turn spells. So, yeah, keep a good eye on this. This might actually see some standard play. But I'm still going to give it a 7 out of 10. And no, it's not just because it'd be cheeky because it costs 7 mana. It's mostly just because we have stuff like Mystical Dispute in the format, and just essentially we have aggro in the format that might make it where even if you control the best you can, you might not survive to turn 7 or turn 6. So, especially if you have to pay the 2 mana to foretell this, while not trying to control the aggro. I still think it's a good spell, though. We'll save this for last. I got a lot to talk about this, but we'll save that for last. Next up, draft card only, but still, fun bird. I do like the art on it. Behold the Multiverse. 3 in a blue for an instant, scry 2, then draw 2, or you can foretell it for 1 in a blue. This card's pretty good. This card is actually really good. Just a common scrying 2, then draw 2 cards. That in Papa in itself is going to be good because that's a Glimmer of Genius. Granted, you don't get the energy, which is kind of costly, but the factor is, I think a lot of people are going to underrate the factor is that due to the foretell ability, you can actually, you are still technically spending the 4 mana, but the fact that you can split the mana is pretty powerful. And just, where do I begin with this? Just the factor is, what makes this card really good is the factor that you can foretell for 1 in the blue. So that means that essentially a lot of people, control decks in general, will mostly just counterspell at turn 3, and then turn 4, hold up a counterspell if they need to. If they don't, then they play the Glimmer of Genius. That's kind of like how decks usually run. But the factor is that you can actually technically, let's say, still like have this on turn 2 if they don't play a spell that's that threatening, spot removal on turn 3, and then turn 4 counter with like an Essence or a 2 mana counter spell, and then being able to activate this to then scry 2 and then draw 2 cards. That's really good. I think you should not underrate the aspect that you can foretell this card. I think the foretell ability makes this card legit. And later down the line in the game, when you don't need to foretell it, you can just cast this for 4 mana to scry 2 and draw 2 cards, which control decks are just going to love. Control decks are going to love this card. I could even see some mid-range decks playing this. It's a pretty good card. Don't underrate it, plus the art is pretty good. As for the score, I'll give it an 8 out of 10. It's that good. Glimpse of the Cosmos. 1 in a blue for a sorcery. Keep that in mind. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. Put 1 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. And then it has a second ability that as long as you control a giant, you may cast Glimpse of the Cosmos from the graveyard by paying blue rather than paying its mana cost. If you cast this card from the graveyard, cast it this way and put it into the graveyard, exile it instead. I want to like this card, don't get me wrong, but it's a sorcery speed spell. Yes, this is an anticipate you can cast twice, as long as you have a giant, which is nice. So you can like have cast a giant and then cast this to help build up your next turn. That's really cool. But I do think the sorcery speed on this card is probably the thing that's going to drop the score for me a little bit. Because mostly for anticipate-like spells, you want them at instant speed, just being able to hold up counter magic and such. Now, you could make an argument that if you're playing this in a creature-oriented spell deck, aka the Giants deck, so to speak, that you really don't mind the sorcery speed aspect of this, because you're just going to be casting Giants and it's more of going to be a sorcery speed control deck. I can definitely see that argument, but I don't know. I feel like I'm not going to say this card won't see play, because if the Giant decks become a thing, they might legit play this as a 1 or 2 of, so I'm not going to deny that. But the thing is, you have to play the Giants decks to make this really good. If you're not playing the Giants deck, then this is a 2-mana Anticipate at sorcery speed. And in a format that has Anticipate in the format, you will just play the Anticipate over this. So yeah, good if you're playing the Giant deck, but not really good anywhere else, so I'm just going to give it... Honestly, I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10. I think it's good only specifically in that one specific deck, and even in that one specific deck, it's not amazing. It's good, but it's not, like, amazing. Okay, let's get to the big monster they revealed. The return of the Phyrexians. Let's talk about Vorincex Monstrous Raider. 6 mana for a legendary creature, Phyrexian Praetor. It's a 6/6 with trample and haste. Oh, and it has the ability that if you would put one or more counters on a permanent or player, so that could be energy, that could be planeswalker counters or such, that could even be just +1/+1, or age, or saga counters, essentially. Whenever you do that, put twice that many of each of those counters on that permanent or player instead. And then, if an opponent would put one or more counters on a permanent or player, they put half that many of each of those counters on that permanent or player instead, rounded down. As I pretty much said on Twitter, where do I begin with this card? Here's the thing. On its own, a 6 mana 6/6 with trample and haste, that is legit really, really good. Don't underrate that ability on this card. A 6 mana 6/6 trample and haste, that's perfectly fine in mid-range decks. Mid-range decks are going to love to play a 6 mana 6/6 with trample and haste. So by that alone, it's a good card. But the effects that this card has is what makes this card go from good to pure insanity. Here's the reason why. The factor is, this is a doubling season. Now, granted, it's a counter-only doubling season. It doesn't double your tokens, but it's a doubling season for your counters. Doubling season is a really powerful card. Especially, now, some people might make the argument, well, yeah, we did have a standard season where doubling season was a card, but it wasn't really that popular in the standard format when doubling season was standard legal. Why would this be different? 1. Mostly it's because the Planeswalker creatures that were in Standard during that format, yes, there were some really good ones. You would want to cheat out the ultimate quick, which, by the way, the reason why I'm talking about this is because technically this doubles ETB Planeswalker counters, so if a Planeswalker loyalty has 4, it will enter in as 8 and such. The Planeswalkers in general that were very popular within the Standard meta at the time where Doubling Season was a legal card, they were not really that popular enough to be able to cast. And, like, let's say, for example, like the Elspeth at that time. The Elspeth at that time had a pretty powerful ultimate, but you first want to have a board presence first before you cast that. So you want to essentially make sure to have creature-oriented development before you activate the ultimate. Like, stuff like that, essentially. Like, the Planeswalkers were good, but they weren't like, hey, I want to activate the ultimate on this as fast as I can, so I want to have a doubling season-like card in my deck design. This, on the other hand, we are in a standard meta where lucky enough there's not that many planeswalkers that can be ultimated with this ability. But the ones that are in the standard format are pretty good. We have Garrick, we have the new Garrick from the core set, which essentially then you can just activate his ultimate, which then makes it a creature tutor at the beginning of upkeep, which is insane. We also have the new Kaya coming into the format, which then essentially is, oh hey, you can activate her ultimate. If you play this in an Absent deck, get essentially this creature out and then get the new Kaya out. Oh, bam! You get the emblem automatically, which then allows you to play legendary cards for free at the beginning of each of your upkeeps. So then, let's say this gets removed. Oh, I can just recast Phyrexian and then be able to attack and attack and attack. And I'm not even talking about this in the implications with cards like Ugin in the format and Genesis Ultimatum. Also, even the Sultai Ultimatum is good with this card, because then you can essentially, with Genesis Ultimatum, you ramp, you play Genesis Ultimatum, you get this, you get Ugin, and then Ugin doubles its counters, which then you can ultimate Ugin, activate the ultimate, draw 7 cards, play more permanents, which will be probably Planeswalkers, obviously, and then double their counters, and then essentially repeat the process of activating the ultimates again and again and again, and then building up a board presence that could be lethal for the opponent. That is nothing to underestimate. That is a really, really scary thing about this card. And the factor that then your opponents are affected by this is also something to not underestimate. The fact that your opponents will lose their counters. Let's say they're playing any Planeswalker. Well, boom, that Planeswalker is going to enter in with half counters. They're playing a counter deck. Well, they better make sure that Vorinclex is off the battlefield, because anytime they try to put a counter on something, or a counter on their, like, Ozlith or something like that, boom, you get one less counter if you put a lot of counters on it, or you don't even get a counter at all. I just feel like the standard implications of this card is just insane. Like, there's a lot of janky applications you can do with this card in the standard meta, but there is also a lot, and I mean a lot, of spiky, you're going to see this at the World Tour implications of this card. Don't underrate that. Especially with Ugin and Genesis... Sorry. With Ugin and Genesis Ultimatum in the format, this card becomes insane. So yeah, I think this is going to be the card that if a card's going to get banned this year, it's because this card exists. It might get Genesis Ultimatum banned, it might get Ugin banned, it might even get this card banned. This card is that good. Plus, also, I do love this for EDH, because it does help us against give good tech for counters deck and tech against counter decks. I do like the aspect of this for people who are, like, who do love the Phyrexian kind of like environment, who love Phyrexia when they played it back in Mirrodin Cycle and such, and want to see them back, so they get their Phyrexians back, which is nice. I even like the potential lore implications that this has, which I do need to catch up with the story, since, hey, I called it with Kaya. Okay, little story here. Like I said, this card was initially leaked, so that's why I wasn't going to talk about it initially until it got revealed, which lucky enough it got revealed today. But one of the things that we were talking about, we were trying to determine whether or not the card was fake or not, and one of the things I was like, well, I think this is real, because the Kaya borderless art looks like it has Vorinclex in the background as the shadow of the creature is hunting, and everybody in the Discord or chat was like, nah, it's probably just some giant or something. And then when even Watsy was like, oh yeah, that creature in the background that Kaya is hunting is Vorinclex. It's like, that was like the, I called it! So yeah, that was kind of my little I called it kind of prediction there regarding to that, so... But obviously I couldn't talk about it because, well, it was leaked initially and I didn't want to talk about leaks. So, yeah. Overall, this is a complete 10 out of 10 card. Like, maybe a high 9.5 out of card. And in EDH, it's going to be good. In Oathbreaker, it's insane because, hey, having your Planeswalkers enter in with double counters is pretty good. Also, being just a sit-sit trample. Like, imagine this with cards like the Great Hinge in the format. Like, just being able to have the Great Hinge out and then cast this. And then making an attack as an 8/8 with trample and haste, that's just... it's just insane. So yeah, great card. It's going to see a lot of play. Don't underrate it. It's really, really good. Plus, also, it's really cool that in the collector boosters, if people want to, they can get the Phyrexian art variation of this with Phyrexian tats. So, really good, Chief. Really good. And that's all the cards that got spoiled on day one, with also the squirrel that got spoiled during the holidays. I'll try to get this video uploaded on YouTube, but nevertheless, thanks for all who decided to watch and see my 2 cents on these cards. I hope you all have a lovely night. This is LevDev, signing out. Bada beep, bada boop.